Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show tonight. I don't know what to say. I feel so blessed by the guests that I have on this show every week. You know, that it just gets more and more phenomenal. This week, we're going to be speaking in the first hour with Jeffrey Daugherty about the shocking truth about the Apostle Paul. And I feel like I need some sound effect music with that. And in the second hour with Barbara Hand Clow about romance, mystery, heresy, and a new golden age. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. Give me a call, set up a time for a private consultation, and we can figure out what's going on and come up with some steps for you to move forward in your life with health and harmony. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Well, if you're one of the hundreds, thousands of people that have downloaded or purchased or whatever my movie icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes and the Ancients, one, I want to say thank you. But I have a new video short available also on Amazon.com for digital download, and it's called In the Name of God. You'll have to check it out. In the Name of God. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our first hour guest, and we're going to get him on. And so we're going to be talking about the shocking truth about the Apostle Paul. Did the Apostle Paul hijack the message of Jesus and replace it with his own? Well, we are going to find out from Jeffrey Daugherty. Jeffrey is a Bible college graduate and spent over 20 years as a licensed minister, mostly as a red-hot Pentecostal evangelicist. After personal tragedy led him to a deep revelation of the goodness and grace of the divine, Jeffrey realized that modern Pauline Christianity had warped the message of Jesus into a fear and guilt-based matrix of control. Now he dedicates his life to exposing the lies of the big-time religion. So please welcome the author of Apostle Paul Antichrist, Jeffrey Daugherty. Hey, Jeff, how's it going?
Thanks for the invitation, Dr. Rita. I'm very happy to be here and very excited to be speaking with you tonight.
I'm just so excited to have you on, but I'm going to be nice and start easy. I try to start easy. You have a show, it's called The Christian Whistleblower, which I think is kind of a cool name. But why do you call yourself that? What led you to kind of calling out all the churchy people?
Well, that's a great question, Dr. Rita. And, the first part about, being any type of a Christian whistleblower or whistleblower of any type, you have to have been, first of all, really deeply involved in what you're claiming to be a whistleblower about, or it really carries no validity. I mean, we would not have listened to Edward Snowden if he hadn't worked for the NSA. And I was for 20 years a licensed evangelist, a licensed minister with the Assemblies of God and a few other organizations. I typically worked as an evangelist, which is the guy that goes to churches for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time. And I was a Bible college graduate, 4.0 grade point average in Bible college, dyed in the wool, hardcore, right wing, evangelical, and really believed everything that I was preaching, everything that I was teaching. But somewhere
did you
along,
go around and like heal people, like heal like that?
Do you remember Jimmy Swaggart, Dr. Rita? I was actually kind of reared up under Jimmy Swaggart, and if you think about Jimmy Swaggart, that's about the kind of style and presentation that I was. So yes, lots of healing, lots of casting out of demons, as they say, and things like that.
Okay, keep going. I'm like making sound effects for you. Sorry.
But at any rate, somewhere down along the line, I began to see what I would call the cracks in big time religion. I began to see that things, weren't what they should be, behind the veil, so to speak. And I began to see some things in the Bible where it became very apparent to me. And I fought these things tooth and nail, Dr. Rita, for a long time. I was a big proponent of Paul. Most of the time I preached Paul. And I began to see some real dichotomies between what Paul was preaching and what Jesus preached. And I usually call him Yeshua, so if I slip into Yeshua, you'll know who I'm talking about. But I began to see the difference between the teachings of Paul and the teachings of Jesus. I began to see the differences between what the church is supposed to be and what it really is. And I began to undergo some profound changes in my own life, and that led me to realize that the message of Yeshua, in my opinion, has been changed and perverted into something that it was never intended to be. And Paul was kind of the ringleader of that entire process. So having been a Christian, I feel that I do have the qualifications to say that I was Christian. And to be a whistleblower is kind of to expose the things that, the underbelly, the things that are not supposed to be, the things that are wrong, the doubts, the fears, the mistakes. And then I hate to say this, I used to be a lot more shy about it, but the lies and the mistruths and the deceptions that have been built up and still remain after 2,000 years of Christian indoctrination in the Western world.
Well, and there have been a lot, and that's why I was just so happy to see your book and hear, see that you had this kind of a message. But without, jumping the gun, let's just kind of move through this whole thing just easy like, because we're going to be talking about the Apostle Paul. And so for those people that aren't really familiar with him, who was he? Was he one of the 12 disciples?
That's another great question. The Apostle Paul was not one of the 12 apostles, and he was decidedly not one of the 12 apostles. He actually came on the scene rather late in the whole Jesus story. Basically, you had Jesus and his 12 apostles. They were starting really a different kind of faith, a different kind of religion, if you will. Jesus was pretty much an itinerant teacher and healer and a guy that helped people take confidence in themselves and learn how to accept themselves and grow and experience. And then Paul came along with a message that was quite a bit different. But Paul, you have to understand about Paul, he was a Jewish fellow and a Roman. And Dr. Rita, there were almost no Jews that were Romans, only mainly physicians and some people that worked with the Roman government directly. But there was almost no Romans that were Jews and vice versa. And yet here was Paul, not only a Jewish person, not only a Roman person, but connected to Jewish royalty, including the King Herod, who was king in Jerusalem at that time. Paul was Hasmonean or Herodian, however you want to say it. And Paul was a very close personal confidant with Nero, who, of course, would go on to be emperor. I hesitate to say friends, but I think Paul and Nero were as close as anything that those two men ever came to as being friends. But here's a guy, Roman and Jewish. Here's a guy heavily connected to the royal hierarchy in Jerusalem and heavily connected to the rulership in Rome. So a tremendously unique individual. And I think a man with as much arrogance and as much ambition and maybe as much rhetorical talent as any we've seen in quite a long time. So that was Paul.
Well, and it's interesting because it seems like someone growing up Jewish in a Roman tradition, it's not like in the United States where we're basically, and I'm going to say, a Christian country. And so if you're Jewish, it's not so strange. If you're Muslim, it's not so strange. But I mean, Romans had a lot of gods. You know, they were very different in their viewpoint on the world compared to what we see coming out of Judaism.
Absolutely. And when you add to that the fact that by the time Paul was coming on the scene, the Jews had only been allowed back in the city of Rome for about 10 years. There was tremendous persecution of the Jewish people within the Roman religion. And of course, anybody that had any connection with Rome was viewed with great, my vocabulary's fleeing me, but they were afraid of them. They were viewed with, and again, the word leaves me, but Paul, in spite of this skepticism and in spite of this suspicion, he was able to go and study at the very heights of the Jewish world. He went to the temple in Jerusalem, studied under Gamaliel, who was arguably the greatest rabbi of his time. And the fact that a guy with such deep, strong Roman ties was able to do this is astounding. And the answer to it in my research was that Paul, being from Tarsus, his family was one of the leading families in the textile manufacturing there in Tarsus, which was the center of textile for the entire empire. And his family actually was one of the leading tent makers for the Roman army. So Paul was kind of like the heir of Halliburton. He was maybe a Dick Cheney type of figure. So he was able to leverage great wealth to get into the upper echelons of both Jewish and Roman society.
You know, the image of, well, his family were important tent makers doesn't sound so important now, but maybe back then that was like the big thing. I don't know.
Defense contractors, Dr.
I
Rita.
know.
Think defense contractors.
Do you have any thoughts why he would choose to follow Jesus's teachings?
To be very frank with you, Dr. Rita, I don't think that he ever decided to follow Jesus' teachings. I think he was creating his own agenda from the word go.
Okay, well, we're just going to move on from there. Okay, so let's kind of shift gears. So you've given a background on Paul, but let's kind of shift gears to what was going on in Jerusalem, in, you know, the now Israel area when Paul came on the scene. Actually, let's back up. From your research, do you have any kind of idea, and I don't even know if this material would be available, about what kind of following Jesus actually had in Jerusalem or, you know, in that area during his lifetime?
Yeah, again, another great question. And the fact of the matter is that, and this is much to my chagrin, I've searched high and low and did a lot of work on it, but when a person seeks to find secular, empirical data about the life of Jesus, one comes up very, very frustrated. There's really almost no empirical, secular, extra-biblical data about Jesus as a person outside the New Testament. There's almost none. So answering your question based on that, you know, Jesus came on the scene to a Jerusalem, to a Israel that hadn't heard from God in 400 years. The priests, the prophets, the judges, the heavens were as brass, as they say. It was since the time of Malachi to where Jesus was coming along, silence. But that silence was broken by John the Baptist, who was, of course, considered the forerunner of Jesus. And John the Baptist came out preaching, you know, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, you know, be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. And this wasn't just a religious, you know, church message. A lot of us hear that and we think, oh, that's nice church words. But when you are in a Roman province and you're saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand, a new king is coming around, that gets the attention of Rome. And when you're saying to a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice-based Jerusalem, that now you don't need blood sacrifice. You just need to be baptized to be forgiven from sin. You've now got everybody's undivided attention, and you have now stirred up not one hornet's nest, but two, and you've painted a great big target on your back. And Yeshua, or Jesus, came in on the scene, got baptized by John, and that was his message. The kingdom of heaven message was, number one, you'll be baptized, be forgiven of your sins, and the kingdom of heaven is within you. The spark of divinity is within you. And this flew in the face of Jerusalem and Judaism for sure. And the kingdom part, even though Jesus and John weren't meaning it in a literal kingdom, it still got the attention of the Romans as well. It was borderline seditious speech to Rome, and it was crashing the whole paradigm to the Jews.
I'm going to back you up. Now, I know that, and I'm pretty sure it's just in Josephus, there is a sort of mention of John the Baptist. So scholars believe that he was actually a historical figure. But you said there's almost no record of Jesus, but you hedged it with almost. So is there some kind of a record?
Well, it depends upon how you define record, Dr. Rita. There's three commonly accepted references to Jesus, and one that isn't usually as commonly accepted. I happen to think it's the best of the four. But there's Josephus, which you have pointed out. You know, Josephus, a lot of people wonder about him. If you get into scholarly circles and get out of biblical circles, Josephus' credibility declines rapidly. Tacitus also wrote a very short little bit about a person called Christus, who was, crucified or suffered the ultimate punishment by Pilate. And, this was almost 200 years after the life of Jesus. And scholars say that a Roman would never have called Jesus by the term Christ. And he misidentified the position that Pontius Pilate held as well. So that also falls into some disrepute. And then there's something called and I always get this pronunciation wrong, I should have wrote it down, the Seraphian letter, I think. That's probably, to me, the strongest bit of evidence for Jesus as an actual person in the New Testament. I believe personally that Jesus was a person that walked and talked on planet Earth. As a scholar, I can't prove it by anything other than the Bible. And if I try to say the Bible's true because the Bible says it's true, that's obviously very circular. But the thing that most people miss, Dr. Rita, is this. Jesus himself, of his own words, said, my life and the happenings of my life do not matter whatsoever. He said, my physical life is worthless. That's what he said. But he said, it's my message that gives spirit and gives life. And whatever we believe about Jesus the man, there's no doubt that his message, whether it was a message that just coalesced around a figure that was invented or imagined, or whether it was from a real man, this message is real, this message is true, and this message can still transform lives today, even 2,000 years after it was first presented. So was he a guy? I think he was. Can't prove he was. But I know without a doubt that his message is real and true and has tremendous power.
And I think that he's real. I just find it hard to believe that we could take so much material and not attribute it to one person, even though I think some of the books of the Bible, the New Testament, they took other stories and kind of added them in. But that's not our topic tonight.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go back to my question. So do you think he had a big following? And I'll just throw my opinion out. I think that if he had a bigger following, they would have he would have gotten more press time.
That's a great point.
So what's your thought?
I think he had a big following, but his following was almost exclusively within the city of Jerusalem. So he had a lot of followers. He had a lot of followers in Jerusalem, to the point where Paul's message was not able to take effect in Jerusalem, and where Paul was operating out in the provinces, as they say. But Yeshua, did have a significant following, or Jesus, I'm sorry, did have a significant following within this Jerusalem. But again, if you look to secular history and all of the historians that were in Rome, all of the historians in Alexandria and other places, didn't mention Jesus, didn't mention Yeshua. So to your point, he had a significant following, but probably not at that time a following so large for it to be taken notice by those that were not of a Jewish or a Christian, if we can use that word, persuasion.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we have Jesus. I'm going to assume Jesus is dead. When does Paul come into this whole equation?
Well, a lot of people will disagree with me on this, and part of this is inferential on my part, but I believe if you read the New Testament and read it as it was originally revealed and read it in the literal English, I believe that Paul and Jesus met as boys in the temple, that time where Jesus was left in the temple and his family went back to Jerusalem, and Jesus was talking with the rabbis, if you remember that story. Well, Paul was definitely in Jerusalem at that time and was definitely a student of Gamaliel. That can be proven as much as anything else can be proven, as we talked about our sources. So if Paul was there in Jerusalem studying under Gamaliel at that time, and Jesus spent 3 days talking back and forth with Gamaliel, I can't see how they would not have met one another. So that's the first little meeting of Jesus and Paul, at least in my opinion. And then when you get into the Gospels, you have Jesus addressing a guy that's called, in one place, the rich young ruler, and in another place called the lawyer, or the teacher of law. If you look at the breakdown of those meetings, which I do extensively in my book, I believe that, I'm not going to say I can prove it, but it's just this close, Dr. Rita, that the rich young ruler that Jesus spoke to was Paul. The lawyer, same guy, and Paul was a teacher of the law, was Paul. So I believe in at least 3 occasions, Jesus and Paul met up, and Paul, again, according to my research, and I talk about this exclusively in the book, extensively in the book, I believe that Paul was actually front and center in stirring up that crowd that where Pilate wanted to release Jesus. Paul was probably the central figure in stirring and whipping that crowd up into a frenzy that demanded crucify him.
No way. No way. I mean, because, there was the Passion. Oh my God, don't even get me started on that movie. But anyway, and no way.
And again, Dr. Rita, this is assuming that everything unfolded like we've been told it unfolded.
But why do you think that? I mean, because, all right, this is my thinking. Or was he bumping him off so he could kind of do this like identity theft thing? Well, I'm going to just steal your message and run off with it.
The motivations are, very interesting. And the book that I wrote is almost 500 pages. So, it's something that, is really a conspiracy in every sense of the word. And, I've often asked myself, what was Paul doing? Was he just hateful of the position that Jesus was holding? Did he want to just totally replace them? But I think Paul was at the place where he was able to do something that no one else could do. He was able to work the Jewish side who hate Jesus. He was able to be their guy. He was able to work on the Roman side that wanted to get rid of Jesus because he was starting to cause some trouble and for no other reason stirring up the Jews. So here you had a guy uniquely qualified to work both the Jewish and the Roman end of it. And I believe that I've gone, if you read the book, that there's very, very sufficient evidence to show that Paul actually did lead the crowd. You read about the crowd where Pilate was going to let them go, and then all of a sudden the crowd gets whipped up and they start demanding this crucifixion. And I believe Paul was the source of that stirring up of the crowd. And we spent probably 50 pages in the book giving the evidence for that.
He's gonna burn in hell. Wow. Okay. All right, so he bumped off Jesus in the ultimate, 2,000-year-old conspiracy, and kind of took over, I'm going to say, the message. So do you think that he actually took Jesus's message and moved it forward, or do you think he had his own agenda?
Well, Dr. Rita, it didn't just end with killing Jesus. When, Paul was, in my view, part of the, he was the great protagonist that caused the crucifixion to happen. And then it wasn't but a few months, maybe inside of 2 years later, where Paul, and this is clearly spelled out by Josephus, where Paul murdered James, who was the guy that took over from Jesus. Paul murdered James because James had been writing and talking about Paul preaching a different message than the message of the 12 apostles. And once Paul knocked off James, then it wasn't too long before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And what was a battle, what was at least a discussion between two schools of thought, the school of Yeshua and his 12 apostles, and the doctrines of Paul, what was a battle turned into a rout when Jerusalem was destroyed, and the great number of the adherents of the message of Yeshua were, of course, destroyed in that battle. And Paul's message was the only one left in town. And it's almost remarkable that the original Yeshua message is even still known today. And there's not, many guys, other than, some crazy long-haired ex-Pentecostal evangelists that are talking about it.
You don't think what we see that comes out of, and I'm going to say the Gnostic camp, is more true to Jesus's original message?
That's a great question. If you read the Gospel of John and John's letters and the book of Revelation, if you know anything about Gnostic thought, you'll see a lot of Gnostic thought woven into those passages. Not saying that John was a Gnostic, but saying that John was at least familiar with the Gnostics. And I think you would be 100% accurate if you made the statement that the early Gnostic thought was much closer to the original Yeshua message than is Pauline Christianity. I'd say I would agree with that 100%.
Okay.
And by the way, Dr. Rita, the Gnostics taught that Paul killed Jesus, or that Paul was instrumental in the crucifixion as well.
And then there was the giant cover-up.
That's still going on here today on September 3rd, 2015.
Because there seems like, all right, my thought in the early church, the Jesus church, that there were some differences, but he was a good Jewish boy. All of, the apostles were good Jewish boys. And to me, it doesn't seem congruent, some of the big changes that we see in the religion coming more toward the different traditions, the different holidays, moving the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Basically eliminating Passover, eliminating those things that were so sacred to Jews. Now, I could see them incorporating that into the Jewish Christianity. But do you think that that was all Paul, that he just kind of stripped it clean?
Without a doubt, Dr. Rita, it was all Paul. But the real secret to this, and I didn't touch much on this in Apostle Paul Antichrist, because I'm not sure that, I knew I was aware of it, but I'm not sure why I didn't get it more into this, but the real linchpin to the whole conspiracy is the fact that the New Testament, as we see it today and know it today, it's not just one book that was written by one guy. It's actually 27 books written by 40 different authors. And if the New Testament had been presented to us for 2,000 years in the order that the books were written, we would understand how the Passover and the Sabbath and the core teachings of the Yeshua movement were moved out. We would understand how this whole change from Yeshua's message to Paul's message took place. But the New Testament, as we know it today, is, in my opinion, deliberately, diabolically, but even if you don't believe that, it is completely 100% messed up, jumbled, scrambled. The first books aren't first, the last books aren't last. And if anyone could give me one good reason why a compilation of historical books is presented in any other fashion than in the date that the books were written, that we know without a doubt they were written, I'm all ears. I've challenged apologists. I've been on coast to coast and challenged people. No one has ever come to me with one good reason why the New Testament should be completely scrambled. The only reason, Dr. Rita, is if you're trying to scramble and hide the true development of thought and doctrine and the true progression of what happened in New Testament Christianity from casual observers.
Well, I mean, my knee-jerk reaction would be, oh, Council of Nicaea, 332 AD. But with that said, can you kind of back up and explain what you mean by it was all scrambled up? Because I don't know that everybody is tracking with you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, we think about the Council of Nicaea, and I think that's exactly what people think of, Dr. Rita, when they think about the New Testament being compiled. But the reality is that the New Testament, as we know it, was edited, compiled by one guy in about 160 AD. But what I'm talking about is the New Testament as we have it now. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the nice stories about Jesus. Then you've got Acts and the Pauline letters talking about how Paul came on the scene and brought us more deeper doctrine. And then you close off with John's, prophetic type of writing, like the book of Revelation. But in reality, the first book written in the New Testament was the book of James. It wasn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at all. Matthew was about the 11th book chronologically. Mark was the 5th book chronologically. Luke was the 9th book chronologically. John was the 13th book chronologically. And why are we being fed the line that these are 1, 2, 3, 4 when they're clearly not 1, 2, 3, 4? And if you read the book of James first, which was the first one written, you would see James calling Paul a double-souled man who's unstable in all his ways. Clear reference to the Judaism and the Roman makeup. You'd see James saying, why are you following this rich guy that's throwing you guys all into jail and beating you? Clear reference to Paul, who admitted himself even that he was persecuting, killing, enslaving believers. He was demonstrably rich from the family in Tarsus. You'd have James calling him out clearly. And then you have Paul responding to that. And basically what happens in the New Testament is the apostles write 1 or 2 books. Paul responds with 4 or 5. And there's about 3 or 4 series of that. And if you read the New Testament in the way that it was really written, in the order the books were really published, then you would understand that this was a great theological and philosophical battle of 2 competing traditions. And Paul freely admits this in his writing. And basically, Paul's won out when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
No, you did. You did. Do you think that because he was, a military contractor for the Romans, that he might have had a hand in the rebellion or the stopping the rebellion in, what was it, 72 AD or whatever the date was?
It was 70 AD, and that's fascinating, Dr. Rita, because about 60, somewhere between 59 and 62 AD, Paul was writing, and I believe it's Ephesians, either Ephesians or Corinthians or Galatians. They're all written in a group. And Paul wrote, and he said, there's 2 foundations being built. I'm building a foundation. Other people are building a foundation. And people have to choose carefully which foundation they're going to build upon, because one of them is going to be destroyed by fire. And he said this 10, 8, 7 years before Jerusalem was destroyed by fire. Here's a guy, not only was he Roman, but he was, as close as a friend as either one of them had to Nero, who was by this time on the throne as Caesar. So I don't think I can say or prove that Paul helped instigate the destruction of Jerusalem, but I feel 100% confident saying he knew about it and didn't tell anybody about it, anybody being Jesus or the apostles, because he knew that when Jerusalem fell and the Yeshua movement was destroyed, he'd have clear sailing towards establishing his religion. But how interesting is it that Paul said, look, fire's coming, and fire's going to show which of these two foundations will stand the test of time.
Because we're going to burn you up. Okay. So I have a really good question for you. I even think it's a really good question. Okay, you ready?
They've all been really good.
Oh, but this is like a really, really good one. This was an addition because, that little spirit thing said, no, you need to ask him this. Okay. Narratives that we find in the New Testament, from the different books, bring in concepts like the ascension or the different miracles that we find in Luke. Do you think that those were actually narratives that the apostles came up with because they were Jesus followers, or do you think that they were Paul influenced and that's how all that mess ended up in the Bible?
I think it's a mix. Some of it was genuine, some of it wasn't. And I'm of the belief, I share belief with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said that Paul was the first great corrupter of the doctrines of Jesus, and that in Jefferson's estimation, and I think he might have been a little generous, he said that most of the New Testament is dung from the minds of lesser men, and sprinkled throughout this field of dung are diamonds from the mouth and mind of Jesus and his apostles. This is why I've published a document called the Diamond New Testament, which takes out all of Paul, and hopefully our aim was to take out all of the dung, just leaving the diamond. So I think here's a kind of an interesting thought. The New Testament as we have it is about 300 pages or so. The Diamond New Testament, as I compiled it, is about 100 pages. So about 2/3 of it, I would put in the dung category with Jefferson. And incidentally, Paul wrote about 2/3 of it. So the healings, the miracles, all of these stories about Jesus, some of them valid, some of them added by translators, some of them added to buttress Paul's growing religion. But Jefferson says something very, very interesting, Dr. Rita, and I believe this, that if you really study and really read and really open yourself up to the Spirit, when you read the New Testament, the dung makes itself readily apparent, and the diamond makes itself readily apparent to the true seeker.
Well, and I guess my question was really revolving around the whole part of him dying and then ascending into heaven, because it took him from being a mortal man into being godlike, which they worked it,
Well, Dr. Rita, if you're going to push me into that corner, then I'll very clearly state that I believe from my studies,
okay,
and
push,
that the crucifixion itself was an invention of Paul. The resurrection itself was an invention of Paul. And Paul himself says he was the first one that ever preached both of those doctrines. And John said 40 years after everybody else had finished writing that the apostles knew nothing about the crucifixion or the resurrection. So pushed into the corner, that's what I really believe about it.
All right, the resurrection. See, I couldn't think of that word. The resurrection. I joke around and go, well, Jesus came back and he was a ghost, and that offends people. Like, sorry.
But that's what it says.
Well, I know. Well, it doesn't say ghosts because ghosts are evil and of the devil. And, Jesus can't be evil and of the devil.
Exactly.
But the crucifixion, I've never heard anybody say that was part of this whole additional agenda.
Well, that's pretty. Well, how about that? I don't know if that's good or bad, but actually, the Gnostic thought, it's very clear in Gnostic thought that the resurrection was faked, and that the crucifixion was faked. Some say it didn't happen. Some say it was faked. And, again, I've got a new book coming out, and this kind of gets into all that. But it was it was either one of two things. It was created out of whole cloth by Paul or later translators to help justify Paul's growing religion, or this is possible that the disciple Thomas, who was really called Didymus, which is the twin, it's possible that they actually crucified Thomas as a patsy, saying it was Jesus, and this is what Gnostic thought really teaches, and that Paul's whole crucifixion resurrection scenario was no more than a false flag with Thomas as patsy, and that's why people don't talk about these verses. You probably won't hear it in Sunday school, but Paul says Jesus was seen of the 12 and of Peter after the resurrection. Yes, he was, but what Paul doesn't tell you is all of them said, that ain't the guy that we spent 3.5 years with. Yes, they saw this resurrected Jesus, quote unquote, but they didn't believe it was him, Dr. Rita. Why? Because they knew that he didn't die on a cross, because he'd probably already left Jerusalem to go teach somewhere else.
Okay, so now I'm going, my mind's going, Joseph of Arimathea, and taking him down off the cross and whisking him away, and the whole, that movie,
Are you talking Last Temptation of Christ?
Yeah, I love that movie. That one blew me away. It's like, I'm loving this because it's controversial.
But simple questions, Dr. Rita. How could Mary Magdalene, who was arguably one of Jesus' most close followers, a lady that Augustine called the apostles of the apostle to the apostles, how could she see him walk out of a grave and not recognize it was Jesus? Okay. Stuff like that makes you go,
But if it was, all right, but that's also making the assumption that the guy in the grave, that wasn't Jesus, that did get crucified, wasn't dead either.
Exactly. And you go back to the point of if this crucifixion scenario happened, why was Pilate, a Roman, I forget the name of I don't know if he was a procurator or a different title, but why was he working so hard to get Jesus off if, as the Gnostic tradition teaches, and as I'm leaning pretty hard towards, if he knew that it wasn't really Jesus, but it was some other dude, the twin, that might also go to explaining why he didn't want to crucify this guy.
Yeah.
Lots of
I don't know. You've kind of thrown me a little loop right there, because I haven't ever processed even that line of thought to know what to do with it.
Right.
I mean, that's like the ultimate conspiracy. I'm liking that.
Either Paul invented the crucifixion out of whole cloth, it never happened, because Dr. Rita, how could that event happen and not be mentioned in secular history? It's not.
But I thought there were I thought Matthew, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't even talk about the whole resurrection.
The most incredible thing to me, Dr. Rita, you're talking about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, which would arguably have to be one of the greatest things in the whole Bible. You're talking about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, one of the greatest things in the whole Bible. There's less than 30 verses in the whole Bible that talks about both of those events combined. Isn't that interesting?
That is really interesting. That's really interesting. But I mean, the whole birth narrative, I could see being fabrication. It happened back then all the time, where they took someone else's birth narrative, the whole concept of him being born of a virgin birth and blah, 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 we see in ancient cultures all over the place. So it's not even a new storyline.
It's not even unique.
That I could see that they just plugged in there to, fill space.
The only question, Dr. Rita, is who are the they that plugged that narrative into the New Testament?
Okay, good point. All right, different question. So we have the apocryphal books, and you talked about James. We have Thomas. I'm not a big New Testament reader, so I know there's the book of Mary Magdalene. When you look at those books, do you see the hand of Paul on them as well?
It's very interesting that you asked that, because when you look at these apocryphal books, and almost all of them are, within the Gnostic frame of reference, just about every one of them will speak of Paul, but they'll speak of Paul in the negative. They'll call him the great spouter of lies. They'll talk about the crucifixion never happening. They'll talk about the crucifixion being a fake. They'll talk about even the God that Paul was calling God being a leader of a race called the Archons. So they do mention Paul, but they mention Paul in a very unflattering light, and go as far as to call him the spouter of lies, because he was making up a different story than the true message of Yeshua. And he basically had turned Jesus into a dancing bear for his new gospel, putting things in the mouth of Jesus that he never taught, his disciples never believed, and they would never allow to be propagated in their name.
Well, but then it makes sense why when we did get to, and I'm going to throw, the Council of Nicaea, that they were all Paul people.
Absolutely.
And so if you're going to say mean stuff about Paul, well, that book is junk.
Exactly. And Dr. Rita, just let me say this before, I want to make sure I get this in. Somebody asked me on another show a couple of nights ago, it wasn't my show, but they said, what really caused you to start thinking that something was wrong with Paul? And I remember it distinctly. In fact, a lady quoted a German Jewish rabbi that had written in 1944, I can't remember his name, Beck, I believe, saying a lot of the same things that I'm saying now. And it was interesting because I was in Germany when my first child was born, and it was a boy. His name is Joshua. And I remember sitting there in the hospital thinking, literally, as he was coming out, if this was a girl, then she would be subject to all of these awful things that Paul said, like women should not speak a word in church. It's shameful for a woman to utter a syllable in church. That if a woman wants to know something, let her go home and ask her husband. Paul saying, I would never allow a woman to have authority over a man. Paul saying that women should stay at home and have babies. I mean, Paul was the originator of barefoot and pregnant. And to add insult to injury, Paul saying that women were created for the use and pleasure of man, and that it was the women that sinned, not the man. And I remember thinking very distinctly, if this was a girl, she'd be subject to all that mess. And it just didn't make any sense to me how that could possibly be true about women when Jesus was so respectful of women. And then in the next thought was, why do all of these women keep going into churches when the founder of the religion thinks this thing about them?
I don't know. I haven't wrapped my mind around that one ever. I always have joked around and said, there was Jesus's message, and then Paul sold it. He sold it. Right, wrong, or indifferent, he sold it. And,
he did.
And he got people to buy it and buy it and buy it and whatever. But
Jimmy Swaggart came up a little earlier, and he told me something one day, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but he told me something that has stuck with me forever. He said, Jeffrey, there's two ways to have the biggest church in town. One is to build a great church that serves a lot of people. The other one is to burn everybody else's churches down so you're the last one standing. Paul chose the latter.
Lots of integrity there. Okay. Your book, Apostle Paul Antichrist. Why do you call him Antichrist? Do you think he is the Antichrist?
Great question, and I've been asked that question a lot. And
I'll bet.
and that's one of the reasons I put it, on the book cover, because it makes people pick up the book. But the way I'm using the term Antichrist, and it's talked about within the book, and I'm using it really in the way that Thomas Jefferson used it. Antichrist now, after 2,000 years of Pauline doctrine, and after 100 terrible B movies and a bunch of chick tracks, those little cartoon tracks, and a bunch of evangelists talking about red heifers and rebuilt temples and end time boogeymen. It has this stigma of being descriptive of some end time bad guy boogeyman. But really, the term Antichrist in the Bible simply means against Christ. And like Jefferson said, Paul was the first coryphaeus, Jefferson said very descriptively, which means the leader of the band. He said Paul was the first coryphaeus, the first corrupter of the doctrines of Christ. The New Testament says Antichrist means against Christ. So Paul was the first person against Christ. He was the first Antichrist. And in that sense, he's the Antichrist, not that he's going to be, the end time boogeyman that's going to rise from the dead or whatever. So Paul was the first person to come against the Christ message or the message of Jesus within the church. So it's thoroughly in that sense that I say Apostle Paul Antichrist. It's Apostle Paul against Jesus.
But it seems to me that as a society, we have been brought up by his doctrine. And I mean, and this was kind of my thinking before our conversation today. And if Jesus was, his message is about love and connection, and, it has a much more like Kabbalistic type message, or what people would think is a Gnostic message, or even a Buddhist message. I mean, it's about love and compassion. But where Christian, I hope this isn't offensive to you, but where I see Christianity has gone with people is so far away from that message, because that's the direction that they were sent.
Absolutely. And, Jesus said, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. And we've been taught that means there's one way, it's heaven or hell, turn or burn. But when you read the New Testament, if you translate that literally, what Jesus said was, I have brought you the best of all the ways. I brought you the best of all the truths. And by living in this, you have life and a more abundant life. And there's a reason why you can see a lot of Hindu thought, Buddhist thought, American Indian thought, Indian thought in the message of Jesus, because he's brought together all the greatest messages, all the greatest truths of all of human spirituality of this world, and I would suggest even from beyond, and has put it into one workable, cohesive message that if we live it, we'll have abundant life here and we'll find our true selves down the road. But that message, Dr. Rita, is not a message that lends to people that are controllable. It's not a message that leads to people that will march in a line. It's not a message that leads to people that will do exactly what you want them to do. That's a message that leads to rams. And what the powers that be in this world need is a message that produces sheep. And Christianity today says, you're not born with divinity in you. What's wrong with you? You're born with original sin. And if you don't recognize that original sin and come to us, the church, who are the only people that can free you from it, and if you don't continue to do what we do, how we say to do it, when and where we say to do it, then you're going to miss out on this place called heaven and go to this other place called hell. So that matrix of fear, that matrix of control, that is what makes for a population that can be very easily controlled. Because when you can control this life and the next, you've got a very powerful fear and guilt-based control matrix. Yeshua's message creates people that realize that they have divinity within, that realize they've got a path to love one another, build one another, and realize they're going to someplace better than this, and are willing, if necessary, to go through maybe some stuff here with the long term in view. You can't control them. You can't hurt them. It's hard to get them to shoot their neighbors and hate their neighbors. That's why the message of Yeshua had to be stopped, because it was gaining strength and it was going to get this whole control matrix of Western civilization messed up. And Paul rode to the rescue.
Your comment about, the control and the lore of heaven, but based on the criteria that they put out about what you need to do in order to get to heaven, is there even anybody there? God must be really lonely.
Exactly.
I mean, I guess unless you count, like, Oh, go ahead. It's not about the tuna fish, right?
No, and the guy goes up to heaven. St. Peter meets him at the gates. He gives him a little tour. Says, "Who are these guys here? Oh, those are the Lutherans. Oh, the people. Who are over here? Oh, those are the Baptists." He sees a group way off in the distance. He says, "Who's those people way over there?" And he goes, "Hey, quiet. Those are the Pentecostals. They think they're the only ones here."
That's pretty funny. See, I had heard something similar with God and Mother Teresa and him making her tuna sandwiches. But I'm not going to.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard that one.
I'll tell you off air.
Okay.
So let's see. I'm just a really bad joke teller. So I'm a storyteller, but an awful joke teller.
Well, I'll look forward to that off the air then.
Do you think people will ever recognize that they have been led astray? Do you think people are starting to recognize that what they're following in the Catholic Church? Well, actually, you know what? Cancel that question. I have a more important question. There's all this tension in the Islamic world, and we know that, Islam is based on Judeo-Christian traditions or an Abrahamic tradition.
Exactly.
Do you think that they were influenced by Paul's religion, and like that Muhammad was influenced by Pauline Christianity?
Well, Muhammad probably looked at the things that Paul was able to accomplish and took some cues from him. I mean, you could certainly extrapolate, Muslim treatment of women is certainly along the same frame of as Pauline treatment of women. And you hit a nail on the head there that most people realize. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all Abrahamic religions. It's basically the same players, just a little bit different. And I think that's a key to a very interesting, vast and devout subject that we don't have time to talk about today.
We don't. You said you have a new book coming out. When's that due out?
Well, that should be out by Thanksgiving time at the very latest, hopefully a little bit before that, maybe in October. And, that's something I'm looking forward to. I'll give you the title of it. I've been reluctant to release it, but it's going to be called The Final Message of the Last Apostle, Alien Agenda in the New Testament.
Well, okay. All right. So I'm going to give you a date right now, because I love doing like weird controversial stuff. When we're getting close to like Easter, that whole time, do you want to come back on?
Absolutely. I'd love
to. It'll be enough time, between this visit and that visit, but then like you can be my Easter show.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that.
Cool. Okay. Because I know the music's going to come up. And so we need to go. If they want to get this book, Apostle Paul Antichrist, where's the best place for them to go?
The easiest thing is just to go to jeffreydaugherty.com or christianwhistleblower.com. If you just Google Apostle Paul Antichrist, it comes up at the top of the search. So it's pretty easy to get it, or the Diamond New Testament, or find out about any of the other fun and happy heresy that we're spreading at jeffreydaugherty.com.
Or your show.
Or the show, The Christian Whistleblower. It's on every Wednesday night for 2 hours. It's on Wednesday night, 7 to 9 p.m., or 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time.
All righty. All right, so the music's here. Gotta go. Jeffrey, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Dr. Rita. Thanks for allowing me to join you.
Okay, thank you. That's Jeffrey Daugherty. His webpage is Jeffrey Daugherty.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.